Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. This week I'm coloring a digi-stamp. This is a digi-stamp I purchased from Etsy, and I will link that shop down below. I was trying to decide what I wanted to color today. I was kind of feeling a little bit not in the mood for more florals. And while I was chatting on the phone with my daughter, we came up with this super cool dragon on the balloon. I am going to turn this into a shaker card. I also will do a little bit of stenciling in the background after I have him colored to kind of create the illusion of clouds. They are very faint. Even in real life, they're very difficult to see. I don't think they photograph super great. I will use a sequin mix for the shaker bits, and I think that's all we need to know about the coloring. For the most part, I'm going from darkest to lightest and back over it again. This big balloon did take a couple of passes, but yeah, I think that's all about the coloring. So let's jump into our crime. Our alphabetical journey today is taking us to the state of Tennessee. Now, when the British were in control of the part of the world that became the United States, the land west of the Appalachian Mountains was reserved for Native Americans only. No one was allowed to settle there. But when the British lost the American Revolution, the state of North Carolina claimed all of the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and people began to move in and settle it right away. Many of those settlers actually broke treaties that had been created for the protection of the Native American people on those lands. And that resulted in many years of warfare and bloodshed between the settlers and the Native Americans. These new settlers complained that North Carolina was not doing a good job of protecting them because, they moved into places they should not have. And North Carolina decided to give the land west of the Appalachians back to the federal government, which was then located in New York. The settlers in this area were excited. They wanted to make their own state, and they were going to call it the state of Franklin. And this was the first attempt in making a state on the western side of the Appalachians. This group had created a constitution, a legislature, and they had chosen a governor, John Seaver. But there was a problem. The federal government did not have a plan in place to allow for the creation of new states. They hadn't got that far yet. So it just gave the land back to North Carolina, and Franklin did not become a state. Even though the state of Franklin was in a state of existence for like 4 years, it never really became a state. So after the state of Franklin failed, the land that is now Tennessee became part of a large territory called the Territory South of the River Ohio. Later, it was shortened to the Southwest Territory, and George Washington put William Blount in charge of this new territory. For the first time, there was actually an official government representation close to the people it was meant to serve. So more and more people began moving into this area, and they tried again to form a state. The first step was for a census to be taken, and the census showed that there weren't enough people to form a legislature and write a new state constitution. The state would be called Tennessee, and this time it worked. On June 1st, 1796, President George Washington made Tennessee the 16th state to join the United States, and John Seaver was again picked to be the first governor. And if you think all that was interesting, let me tell you a few more fun facts about Tennessee. Tennessee is the birthplace of Mountain Dew. Tennessee holds a tie as the state that is most bordered by other states, with a total of 8 states on its borders. True Tennessee whiskey, wow, can't even say that word, Tennessee whiskey can't be made anywhere else in the world. In 1908, the state had hundreds of registered distilleries, but many of them were wiped out when the Prohibition laws began to be enacted. Tennessee is home to the world's oldest radio show, the Grand Ole Opry. Cotton Candy and the Moon Pie were born in Tennessee. It is also the birthplace of America's first female senator. Hattie Caraway was born in Bakersfield, Tennessee in 1878, and she would go on to become the country's first woman elected and re-elected U.S. Senator, but she represented Alabama, not Tennessee. Tennessee is the location of Elvis Presley's home, Graceland, and Graceland is the second most visited home museum, coming in second only to the White House. About 100 miles away from Nashville stood the world's tallest tree house in the town of Crossville. It was a major tourist attraction. The structure stood 97 feet tall and unfortunately was burned to the ground in 2019. And Tennessee is also home of the Great Western Land Pirate. John Andrews Murrell was born in Lunenburg County, Virginia, sometime in 1804, but was raised in Williamson County, Tennessee. John was the son of Jeffrey and Zilpah Murrell and was the third of 8 children born. However, one family tree showed 10 children, so I don't know. I did not look at the birth and death dates of all the children, so maybe a couple did not survive birth. Anyway, the Murrells were said to have been an extremely handsome family. And according to the Columbia Herald Mail, quote, John A. Murrell especially was remarkable for his manly beauty, curling auburn hair, worn long generally, decorated a classic head and a prepossessing face that would, said an observer, have drawn attention and been noticed among 1,000 people. And then they went on to talk about how his sister was also beautiful and a skillful dancer. Words are hard, y'all. Now, not only was John handsome, but he was educated and apparently well educated. He possessed a brilliant mind and was apparently able to adapt to almost any environment. And this skill in particular, I mean, all of these things, but particularly the ability to adapt, was an asset that came in handy as John pursued a life of crime that is, according to some people, unparalleled in Southern history. John's father, Jeffrey, moved to Middle Tennessee and purchased 146 acres in Williamson County. He purchased property next to one brother, and another brother of his lived a little bit away in Dickinson County. He also purchased land that was near his father-in-law, Mark Andrews. And it seems that crime may have been John's birthright. Apparently, John's dad was a Methodist preacher who traveled and was gone a lot. And legend has it that John once said of his father that his father was an honest man, but John thought none the less of him for that. His mother, however, apparently taught him and the rest of her children to steal. His mother ran an inn, and when John was a teen, he learned how to steal things, assumedly from the people who stayed at the inn. John said, that his mother was one of true grit, and that she taught all of her children to steal as soon as they could walk. And whatever they stole, she would hide it for them, and then did not allow her husband, their father, to correct them for their stealing. So John had a taste of the criminal life from a very young age. Now, the dates and his age of his first prison term are a little bit up for grabs. One source said his first conviction was 1826. Another source said it was 1823. So somewhere between the age of 13 and 16, okay, John robbed his family treasury. So he stole from his whole family $50 and left home and took off for Nashville. And while he was in Nashville, he was arrested, tried, and convicted for stealing a black mare from a widow in Williamson County, Tennessee. So he was tried in Davison County, and after his conviction, he was branded at the base of his thumb with the letters HT for horse thief. In addition, his punishment included a flogging and then a prison sentence. And again, there's some conflicting information here. One source said that conviction was 3 years. One said it was 12 months. So anyway, he was jailed as a teenager for stealing a horse. Douglas Anderson was a writer for the Nashville Banner, and he wrote that there was another young man named C.W. Nance who was actually there at the time of John's branding. And this is the gist of the conversation between C.W. and Douglas. So John was taken to the prisoner's box and instructed to lay his hand on the railing, and the sheriff took a piece of new hemp twine from his pocket and tied John's hand to the railing. Another man named Jeffrey brought a tinner's stove that looked like a lantern and placed it on the floor. Now, C.W. claimed that he was anxious to see what was going on, so he climbed up right in front of everything and everybody and was sitting on the railing next to John's arm. Now, the Sheriff Horton, took a little branding iron from the stove, and according to this young boy, what's his name, C.W., it was he described it as what tinners used as a soldering iron. So I'm kind of picturing something that's used for wood branding, like wood engraving right now, I don't know. Anyway, the sheriff got this little iron and put it under a heat source until it was red hot, and then he branded the skin at the base of John's thumb. When he was done, Sheriff Horton untied John's hand, and John, who up to this point in time had never even made a sound, he pulled out a white handkerchief and wiped his hand off. And then John was taken away to have his lashings and put into his jail cell. And it was reported later on in life that he always wore gloves to prevent that brand from being seen by other people. Keep in mind that this is the early 1800s, and horse thievery, he's lucky all he got was branded. They used to hang people. At this point in time in history, you could get hung for that. So, after John's jail term, whatever that time may be, he embarked on a life of crime that lasted several years. And by the time he was 30 years old, he had been given the nickname Land Pirate. And he was one of the most feared men along the Natchez Trace. And I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I forgot to Google how to say it before I started the voiceover. So, John liked to gamble, and he liked to drink, and he liked to travel. He was often seen in Natchez and in New Orleans. He was also seen in parts of Alabama. Occasionally, he claimed to be a preacher. Okay, he really wasn't. But while he was preaching, his crew of criminals were robbing the people's homes while they were at church. Okay, so he had kind of created, or what's the right word for, I don't know, he created this little clan of criminals. And apparently they had the reputation of just shooting anybody they thought had money. And one time, the story goes that there was this young boy who claimed to have money, so they shot him to rob him, and it turned out he only had $1.50, which, now is not much, but then, even then, wasn't really enough to kill a man over. And apparently, according to the word on the street, John's clan, after that, would only shoot people after they verified that they had money. So, as I said, John had been robbing people for a while, and he had formed this clan of outlaws, and they had this practice of meeting in certain places to initiate new members. They also had created hand signs and hideouts. And the way that clan members could tell other members' homes was that they would have a black locust tree and a yucca plant planted in certain parts or certain locations in their yards. Excuse me. So clan members, as they were traveling around doing their thievery, would know which houses they could stop at and get a rest or a meal. And if a house had only one of the two plants, that meant that the people in the house weren't actually clan members, but that they were friendly to this gang of outlaws. Now, there is a story about a man who lived close to Mount Carmel Church, and his grandfather supposedly had been in John's clan, but wanted out. And he got out. He got sick, he was in bed, and all of a sudden, a stranger burst through the door and shot him. And the legend became that you didn't get out of the clan and live to tell about the clan. So it sounds like it's kind of like the precursor to Fight Club, right? Oh my gosh. Anyway, in addition to being a thief, John was known as a con man. His most famous con, John was best known as a slave thief, which also in the 1800s could get you hung. And by his own admissions, he stole more than 100 slaves. And here's the con. He would steal a slave, sell him, steal him again or her again, and sell that slave again. And he did that. He would still steal and sell the same slave until he feared that he had done it so often that slave might be recognized. Then he would kill the slave and move on. And his motto was, "Dead men tell no tales." So this man is not a nice man, y'all. He's just not nice. Now, there was another thing about John. He liked fancy clothes and he liked beautiful horses. And when he was seen in Nashville or Natchez or New Orleans, he was exquisitely dressed and he was always riding fine horses. And usually these possessions came from travelers he waylaid along the trail. John would always kill the people he robbed, and anytime he did, he reportedly said, "Dead men can't tell tales." Now, there was a man, a Mr. Luther, reported one day that he had been stopped by John and the clan, and that they robbed him. And as they were about to kill him, John told them to stop and let the man ride away. Well, this man started wondering what they had done. So this crazy man, rode back to them and said, "Why did you not kill me? Why did you spare my life?" And John's reply was to ask your wife. So supposedly this man returned home and asked his wife. And she told him that one time John had been shot and she had nursed him back to health. And while she was nursing him, John had seen a picture of her husband, and he recognized him that day, and this was John's way of thanking her for saving his life. I know. Now, the biggest scheme that John had, it was big. Now, one thing to note is that a lot of the criminal gang would hide out in places that were harder than average to get to. And there's this group of lakes that have been created next to the Mississippi River as the Mississippi River kind of changes its borders. They're called Oxbow Lakes. And Arkansas has this little lake called Lake Shanot. And at the upper end of this lake is a little island called Stewart's Island. Now, this island was actually a stronghold for John and his outlaw band. And at one point in time, over 1,000 men belonged to this outlaw clan. And this island was the birthplace of the most ambitious of John's schemes. This horse thief, murdering man, slave stealer, human being seller, planned a slave uprising. And in his mind, this would culminate with the overthrowing of the city of New Orleans. Now, in order to lead this uprising, John created a new outlaw army called the Strikers, and they met regularly in secret locations in Arkansas while they finalized their plan. Originally, this uprising was supposed to occur on Christmas Day of 1834, but it was moved to July 4th of 1835. And the plan was for all of the slaves in the area to turn on their masters and kill them. And reportedly, there was 2 slave girls were taking care of the master's baby, and the wife overheard them saying, "It sure will be a shame to kill this baby." And so the mom of this child heard that. She couldn't get the girls to tell her anything. So she called her son in and to whip them, to make them talk. And they talked, but they blamed the uprising on somebody else. And a bunch of people were accused and then hanged. And it was bad. People were being hung because the finger was being pointed at them as to belonging to this insurrection. Now, one of the ways that John was able to create this army was to ride around plantation country and convince slaves to rebel instead of run away. He promised them freedom, he promised them power, and eventually he had himself a ghost army full of slave soldiers. Now, John would never lead this army because in 1834, he was betrayed by one of his own lieutenants. You see, at some point in time, John stumbled upon a man named Virgil Stewart. Virgil Stewart was actually chasing John down because John had stolen some slaves from a man named Reverend Henning, and Virgil was a friend of this reverend, and he had offered to track John down and get his slaves back. Now, for whatever reason, when John met Virgil, any amount of common sense he had left his mind, and I shouldn't say common sense, I should say desire to stay alive, left his mind, and him and Virgil reportedly became friends. Now, this is all according to Virgil. He took Virgil into his clan and was bragging about all of his crimes. And Virgil claimed that when John wasn't looking, he would write them down. Eventually, Virgil was able to get away and lead people to where John was. John was captured, he was tried, and he was convicted for stealing slaves. This conviction carried a prison sentence of 10 years. So from the year 1834 until 1844, he was actually serving time in the Tennessee State Penitentiary, which we'll come back to that in a minute. While John was behind bars, or because John was behind bars, it was relatively safe for Virgil to talk to people outside of the courtroom. And man, did he talk. He talked about this planned revolt. And by June of 1835, the entire southwest of the United States was in panic. There was a real fear, apparently, of this slave uprising everywhere from Nashville to New Orleans. People were taking precautions, and it was just a high tension area, especially in sparsely populated areas like Mississippi. On June 30th, there was a group of white men. They fell upon a group of black men, And after beating them, or beating some of them, a young boy named Joe broke down and admitted the revolt. And he admitted that the revolt was planned for the 4th of July, because the slaves would not be, they were allowed to, it was a holiday, right? It's Independence Day, and the slaves were allowed to assemble without suspicion. On July 2nd, any slaves suspected of belonging to this revolution were hung. So this was bad. The Nashville Banner reported that conspirators planned after the first strike in Madison County, and then they planned to go down to Natchez and then New Orleans, and the plan was to murder, and I'm quoting here, all white men and ugly women, sparing the handsome ones and making wives of them. And they were going to plunder and burn everything down as they went. And they were going to kill, and they were going to recruit all the slaves, and they were going to do that until the South fell under the control of this criminal army. So whatever happened with this uprising, John was obviously not there to lead it, and he spent 10 years in jail. While he was in jail, he was trained to do a few things, and one of them was blacksmithing. After his release in 1844, he wasn't heard of again. Like, he did not return and rise to power. He did not make public appearances. He just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, there's a number of theories here. Some people say that he repented, he became a good Christian, and he lived the last years of his life as a Methodist in good standing, dying of tuberculosis that he contracted while in prison. Others say that while he was in prison, his mind cracked, and he left jail as an imbecile and disappeared, and his final outcome is unknown. A third theory argues that he went to Bledsoe County and worked for a man named John Billingsley as a carpenter, and that he died in the home of Mr. Billingsley and was buried in a graveyard near Smyrna Church. There's another story that kind of goes along with that third option. According to legend, John discovered that there was some who wanted him dead, so he faked his own death. He found a man approximately his own size, murdered him, and buried him as John A. Merle. And then, learning that his enemies were not satisfied, he exhumed the body, violated the grave, severed the man's head, and buried it in an unknown location. And then a short time later, when the grave was opened and the body was discovered, there was no way of proving that it wasn't John because the head was missing. The head was missing. Now, thanks to a Mr. Thomas Swafford of Tennessee, it appears he's done some research, and we know a little bit more about John's last days. Apparently, John spent his last days in Pikeville, Tennessee, which is about 50 miles from Chattanooga. It seems that after his release from prison, he went to Pikesville to drop out of sight. He had learned to be a blacksmith in prison, but eventually could not do that job because he did, in fact, come down with tuberculosis. Now, rumor also has it that John had joined a church and lived a pretty straightforward life after his release from prison, and had even become a singer in the local church. It is rumored or reported that he died in Pikeville on November 3rd, 1844. After his death, grave robbers, supposedly 2 doctors, dug up the body and decapitated it. It seems there was a reward for John's skull. Presumably, the headless body still is in rest in the Smyrna graveyard. And there's a huge rock slab used to cover the grave. And today the tombstone reads John Mural on that grave. In a deathbed confession, John admitted to being guilty of most of the crimes charged against him except murder. He claimed to never have murdered anybody. And just to add to the mystery of the man, John Adams Mural, on March 5th of 1829, in Murray County, Tennessee, John got married. John married Elizabeth Mangum, and they had 5 children. Leanne in 1829, Geoffrey in 1830, John in 1834, Artace in 1831, and Missouri in 1833, presumably right before he went to jail, or maybe after he went to jail. But dude, when did he have time to have a wife and 5 kids? He's gallivanting all over the Southwest, killing people, stealing things, stealing horses, stealing slaves, selling slaves, causing uprisings. When did he have time to get married and have 5 children? I do not even understand. And I could not find information on their married life. Like, I looked. I could find records of their marriage in more than one place. I found it on Find a Grave. I found it on Ancestry, and I found it on Family Search. I found the names and the birth years of their children. In fact, Find a Grave, I think, even has his children's spouses listed. But when did he have time to get married and have 5 children and be a robber and a murderer and a slave stealer and a person seller and a horse thief? And oh my heavens, the man must have had like ADHD. He must never have slept. That's all I'm saying. He must never have slept. Anyway, back to the story just a little bit. In reality, it appears that John A. Murrell, and I'm probably pronouncing his name different. It's spelled a couple different ways, Murrell and Murel. Okay. So I'm probably not pronouncing it right. But anyway, it seems that maybe he was nothing more than a charismatic organizer and a leader of a small-time band of thieves and slave stealers. Okay. There are many outrageous criminal acts associated with John, and many of them may have been committed by men with no real link to John's, I'm using air quotes here, clan of criminals. Many of the stories associated with this Murrell clan, again, I'm using air quotes, are myth, legend, and fiction. But this man, John Andrews Murrell, became known as the Great Land Pirate and the leader of the notorious Murrell clan. Now, there is one record that has to be trusted. I mean, it's an official record. And this is the record of the Tennessee State Prison Record Book. And I'm reading from an excerpt from that record book. John A. Murrell was received in the penitentiary August 17, 1834. He is 5 foot 10 and a half inches in height and weighs from 158 to 170 pounds. Dark hair, blue eyes, long nose, and much pitted with smallpox. Tolerably fair complexion, 28 years of age. Born in Lunenburg County, Virginia, and brought up in Williamson County, Tennessee, his mother, wife, and 2 children reside in the neighborhood of Denmark, about 9 miles from Jackson, Madison County, Tennessee. His wife's maiden name was Mangum. He has a scar on the middle joint of an index finger next to the little finger of his left hand, and one on the middle finger of the same hand, a scar on the inside of the end of the finger next to the little finger of the right hand. So, like, describing his features, right? Has generally followed farming, was found guilty of stealing slaves at the Circuit Court of Madison County and sentenced to 10 years confinement in the jail and penitentiary house of the state of Tennessee. So that 10 years would have been hard labor. He would have learned the carpentry, he would have learned the blacksmithing, but he would have been doing hard labor, and it appears that he did, in fact, contract tuberculosis while he was in prison those 10 years. And he was in prison not too far away from where his wife and at least 2 of his children and some of her family members were living. So that's all I ever got about his family, other than that they exist. Now, I will say that on John's Find a Grave page, family members have stated that all of or most of the crimes attributed to John are fiction, with the exception of the ones he was tried and convicted of, so the horse stealing and the slave stealing. And they believe that this malignment of John Andrews began when Virgil Stuart published a pamphlet in 1835. So John's descendants believe that Virgil's storytelling is all fiction, and all of the things that Virgil Stuart said he saw when he was looking for John on behalf of his reverend friend, and then initiated into this clan of criminals, John's family, or descendants rather, believe that to be false. So I have kind of two minds about this. I believe that John was probably a criminal. We have trial evidence and prison records indicating that he was in fact put in prison for horse thievery and slave stealing. But I also believe his descendants might be right. I think there was probably a lot of criminals during that time frame in that area that if they could get away with a crime and blame it on somebody else, they 100% were going to do it. So I think that maybe that's why he has this reputation of being this, land pirate. But I don't know, maybe he was just a really bad dude, and people are just, I don't know. Tell me down below. Do you think that he was a little criminal or a big criminal? I mean, leave me a comment below and tell me, because I could go either way. I have pictures though. So I have two competing pictures of John. I have a couple of pictures to show you, actually. First one's of the card, of course. Got to show you that cute little dragon. But this is the, quote, official portrait of John. It's actually a sketch, not a portrait, obviously. The next one is a picture somebody drew based on his physical description. I think that's a better likeness. I mean, looks better to me. I don't know. I also have a picture of his grave marker in the Smyrna Cemetery. And the state of Tennessee has erected a historical marker on a place where he used to live. So thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you liked the story. I have a couple of other videos here I think you might like. I've also added a subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me what you think about this story, because like I said, I could go either way. Do me a favor, give me a thumbs up, tell YouTube you liked the video, and have a really great day.